Good afternoon. Is my mic on? Yes. Yeah, it is. Good afternoon and welcome to the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. We're delighted to have all of you here. Before I offer my opening remarks, I think we're honored really to have Jim Marshall, the newly ordained head of the U.S. Institute of Peace, to talk a little bit about the institution and where it's going. It's a force in the world that that does extremely important work. And before I ask Jim to come up, I'd like to tell you a little bit about him, very, very briefly. Jim was a member of Congress from 2003 to 2011, and he served on the House Armed Services, Agriculture, and Financial Services Committees. He also chaired West Point's Board of Advisors. And the part about his background that I like the best is that he was also the mayor of Macon, Georgia from 1995 to 1999. Jim served in combat as an airborne ranger, reconnaissance platoon sergeant during the Vietnam War. He has received numerous military awards and recognitions, including the Purple Heart, and he's a member of the United States Army Ranger Hall of Fame. Before becoming the head of the U.S. Institute of Peace, he was a visiting professor at Woodrow Wilson School and taught seminars on the utility of American military force. So Jim, please.
Thanks, Peter. I understood that my principal job here was to welcome everybody, so you are all very welcome here at the Institute of Peace, and congratulations on the 10th anniversary for ICNC. It's a great organization. We've had a great partnership with ICNC, and more importantly, a fabulous partnership with Peter himself. Many of you know him. I doubt any of you know to what extent he has been so generous across so many different areas of interest to humanity with the resources that he's managed to cobble together as an individual. I mean, this person puts his money where his mouth is consistently, time after time after time. He's been a great friend to the Institute. I'm really proud to call him my friend as well. Now, Peter wanted me to describe a little bit about where we are and where we're headed as far as the Institute is concerned. Some of you may not know, we're quasi-federal. We have a board of directors. There are 15 of them, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the President of the National Defense University, and then 12 more appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate. By law, only 8 can be in one political party. Our base funding comes from Congress, and it can only come from Congress. We do get money from the State Department, USAID, and the Defense Department. We can raise money to, enhance the building, build the building, do things like that. We also raise money for entertainment purposes. So when you see us lavishly wining and dining somebody, that's not taxpayer dollars that's being used to do that. At any given time, about 1/3 of our professionals are somewhere overseas in pleasant places like Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Burma. I mean, I could go on with quite a list. We're broken into different areas of expertise. One of my favorite recent stories, our rule of law group, has really been very influential in trying to shape the format, the process for countries that are in transition trying to figure out reconciliation, justice, retribution issues, or trying to figure out what sort of process they should go through where their constitution is concerned, and putting together a constitution. I'll give you one example. Sudan, South Sudan, 20 years of conflict. Gosh knows how many people killed, displaced, probably in the millions. They finally settled. South Sudan split off, and the autocratic ruler of Sudan announced that now that the country was homogenous, they would go ahead and redraft their constitution to better reflect Sharia law. Institute of Peace moved in, our rule of law folks, and didn't try to say what the Constitution should look like, but instead made suggestions for what the process should look like. Gathered 40 different local NGOs into an umbrella group, and then the umbrella group worked together to try and figure out what kind of process it wanted to see, and concluded that it should be inclusive, participatory, and transparent, those 3 things. Then we helped with a big public a process of, not protest, hadn't gotten to that point, but a public relations campaign where we were trying to persuade the populace that that's the kind of process that the Sudans should have. Finally, Omar comes out and says, we're going to have a process that is inclusive, participatory, and transparent. Now, we're not naive. This is not going to result in a constitution that looks like the Constitution of the United States, but as a result of the process being changed, you can pretty much assure that the Constitution that is ultimately adopted is more likely to lead to a stable, prosperous Sudan than the Constitution that would have been adopted with just 4 old men in some dark room with a bunch of scribes drafting the Constitution and then announcing it's consistent with Sharia law and the legislature just needs to pass it. So that's the kind of thing we get to do. We've got wonderful people around the globe at any given time risking their lives in order to help people mediate disputes. We train the trainers. We do an awful lot of, as you know, educational courses here and around the world trying to help people better understand conflict resolution. We are a think tank, yes, but more than a think tank, we're very much a do tank. And we've got people globally that are helping not only advancing America's interest in seeing global peace, but also helping local people achieve peace. Peter, anything else you?
That's perfect.
Thank you, sir. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you. Thanks so much, Jim, for coming. I appreciate it. The mission of ICNC has been to advance understanding around the world of nonviolent conflict, also known as civil resistance, which is what people do when they live under oppression or any kind of regime that they find intolerable, but they have no military option. So they use strikes, boycotts, and mass protests to undermine and hollow out the legitimacy of the regime they're in conflict with, to find defectors and to ultimately refashion their elites and to basically force the regime to change or to basically leave. It's a strategy that is distinct from violent insurrection, where those same elites are not approached with a view of defecting, but are basically targets of destruction on their way up through the people at the top, which the violent insurrectionists want to replace. Now, civil resistance has, over the 35 or 40 years that I've been involved with the subject, has been misunderstood for different reasons. For example, one of the early misunderstandings that's changing now is that it's been conflated with nonviolence as an ethical proscript. The problem with that is that 98% of all civil resistance movements have been led by people that, if they had a military option, would have been glad to use it, but they felt that this was a better way to go. Sometimes after they tried a military option and failed. Well, you say, well, what about Gandhi and Martin Luther King? Well, they're less known for their pacifistic views, but for their abilities as leaders of popular movements and their effectiveness as leaders of popular movements. And so they're the exceptions in a way that prove the rule. It has also been conflated, particularly in the peace studies field, with conflict prevention and conflict resolution. Civil resistance occurs where you can't prevent a conflict and you can't resolve it. Negotiation's not possible. And what these tactics are used for is to basically create real pain in your opponent to force a change of behavior that negotiation can't force. These movements are sometimes conflated with protest only. We see in TV mass protests and we think that's the only strategy, but as we're going to see with Adam, that strikes were very important in South Africa, consumer boycotts were critical, and protests are important, but certainly they're not the only strategy. My mentor, Gene Sharp, in his book, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, lists 198 separate tactics, and that's probably a small list. The historic recognition of the impact of civil resistance is also not well recognized. And that's sort of interesting. Since 1972, there have been approximately 70 transitions from authoritarian regimes to democratic regimes. And in over 3/4, campaigns of civil resistance were a prominent part of what created the change. Also, this might not be generally known, but in the fantastic work done by Stefan and Chenoweth, which you can receive outside, and I wish you would pick a copy up, or if not, call us and we'll send you one. They studied 326 insurrections since 1900, 2/3 of which were violent insurrections, 1/3 of which were campaigns of civil resistance. The success rate on the campaigns of civil resistance were 54%, where for the violent insurrections was 27%, and the campaigns of civil resistance were 8 times more likely to create a democratic result. So we have a lot of work to do. We work through the transmission of knowledge by engaging dissidents. That's how we began. Members of academia, we sponsor studies and hold fora. We work with media. We have one person, I don't know where he is, who holds a Center for Authentic Journalism to work with media to help them understand what they should be looking at when civil resistance occurs. And we also work with the policy community. We use an array of engagements, from workshops to films. Our films have now been seen in over 100 countries and translated into 21 different languages. As I said, we use academic studies, media training, and again, if you look out and look at the materials or you go online, you'll see a broad array of things that we're doing. The little blue booklet that we created for this meeting is a precursor to a book we're going to create in the next few months that'll chronicle 980 separate engagements since we started in business 10 years ago. Now, as far as this meeting is concerned, in the policy community, one of the biggest sources of misunderstanding is the belief that campaigns of civil resistance are like brush fires. They appear out of nowhere, burn brightly, and if unsuccessful, burn out without a trace. At this moment, for example, this is the common wisdom about the Green Movement in Iran. Time will tell if that proves to be true. But if civil resistance is successful, we always see coming up the rear a group of regional experts who always fail to predict these things before they happen, who then ascribe the outcome to certain prior conditions, like a weak economy or a leadership that was losing its popularity amongst elites. They do not see the outcome having anything to do with the skills of the civil resistors themselves. Now, our work demonstrates absolutely the opposite, that successful campaigns of civil resistance are almost always preceded by years of preparation and are led by a group of people with a well-developed strategic theory about how to win. In fact, absent leadership with such a theory, these movements are highly likely to fail. In addition, the strategic elements that underline these theories are common to many different conflicts around the world. And they'll tap into a dynamic that's really quite similar if you look carefully at each of the conflicts. So, for example, we find that lessons from the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa are relevant to Iran, and that what happened in Poland is relevant to what's happening in Egypt. And that is why we're here today, and that's why I'm so pleased to introduce Adam Michnik and Said Ibrahim. And so let me give you their bios, and then we'll go right into their discussion. Adam was a Polish dissident and one of the leaders of the Solidarity movement in Poland. He's also the founder and chief editor of the largest Polish daily Gazeta. You might help me?
Wyborcza.
Thank you. Established during the first Polish democratic elections in 1989. Wanda also had a huge help in, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, in the creation of that periodical. In the second half of the 1970s, Adam was a co-founder of the Workers' Defense Committee that provided legal and material aid to persecuted workers and their families. Now, this was the beginning of the anti-regime coalition of workers, intellectuals, that were joined by students, farmers, and other professionals that eventually led to the creation of Solidarity in 1980. Michnik became one of Solidarity's main advisors. And after the introduction of martial law in the early 80s, he was detained and imprisoned and in total spent 6 years in state prisons. He was a Solidarity member to the triumphant roundtable negotiations with the communist government in 1989 and was elected to the first democratically elected parliament in June 1989. Now, Said is an author of more than 30 authored or edited books and more than 100 scholarly articles. He has founded and directed a number of think tanks, and most notably, the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies in Cairo. Now, that's close to our heart because ICNC went to the Ibn Khaldun Center in 2007 and held a workshop with people gathered by Saad, which were a coalition very, very similar to the coalition of people required to launch Solidarity. And we spent nearly a week with him at that time, and many of those people, in fact, all of them, had their impact on what happened to Tahrir Square many years, 5 years later. Dr. Saad was arrested, imprisoned, and persecuted in 2000 for using European Union funds for election monitoring and for allegedly defaming Egypt's image abroad. Mubarak regime sentenced him to 7 years in prison. He was tried twice on the same charges in state security courts, winning each time on appeal, and during a third trial, the highest court in 2003, he was cleared of all charges and released. This independence of this judiciary is a big story that's going to play out, has played out and will play out in Egypt. On the 2nd of August in 2008, an Egyptian court sentenced him to 2 years of prison for defaming Egypt, and he was granted a bail and later went into exile outside of Egypt to avoid probable arrest upon his return. He has returned, and as of this year, he's living in Cairo and again running the Ibn Khaldun Center, which should put on notice anyone in Egypt and might wish to return his country to authoritarian rule. Now, as their biographies show, what they share is that they were working, they were instrumental during early years of preparation prior to the Gdansk shipyard strike and the events in Tahrir Square. And I'll ask each of them to speak for a few minutes about their experiences leading up to those moments, and then ask if they'd like to comment on the remarks of each other. I'll ask a few questions and we'll open up the rest of the meeting for questions from you. So I think, Saad, you're going to begin? Oh, may I do one? Well, Saad, you speak, then I'll introduce Wanda.
Please.
Well, let me also introduce, Wanda is a great friend of Adam's and has agreed to translate Wanda sits on the board, is an important person in himself, sits on the board of the Brookings Institution and is it Cardella Center in Center for International Affairs, which is the
Corbell
Corbell,
School.
the Corbell School in Colorado, and a great businesswoman as well. So Saad, please start.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for a very generous introduction. And I'm delighted to be here in this new facility. I've been to the U.S. Institute of Peace before, but this is the first time in this wonderful premise. I'm also delighted to share the forum to a fellow freedom fighter who was associated with solidarity that inspired many of the freedom movements in the third world. So it really is a pure delight to be here. Now that we are hosted by the International Center for Nonviolence, my remarks will focus on the nonviolence aspects of at least my recent journey in public life. And I'm delighted to see in front of me immediately Mubarak Awad, a Palestinian, American Palestinian, with whom I also shared part of that journey. And why the journey is very arduous in the Middle East, in the Arab world. Because that's a region that has been conflict-ridden, armed conflict-ridden, for the last 70 years. And therefore, to breach nonviolence in a region like the Middle East was like climbing the Himalaya. It really was. And he knows, Mubarak knows. When we first organized the first conference in Amman, Jordan, with that title, we were skinned to the bones, because how could you be breaching nonviolence when nothing in the minds of the political community and the young people at the time, and these were the height of the Palestinian resistance, the Arab-Israeli conflict, all kind of conflicts in Iraq and the Persian Gulf. So to breach nonviolence in that kind of atmosphere was an uphill fight. However, we persisted, and I don't want to, of course, take undue credit for anything, but there are at least very determined few who persisted. And we were always reminded of Margaret Mead's famous saying that never underestimate the struggle of few determined individuals in changing history. In fact, Margaret Mead continues, that's the only way history has changed, by the work of very determined few. And when I saw the crowds in Tunisia, then 3 weeks later in Cairo, shouting, Silmiya, Silmiya, peaceful, peaceful, in the face of the most brutal dictators in our part of the world, yet the crowds who gathered in the squares of Tunisia and in Tahrir Square, which has become now a household word, everybody knows what Tahrir Square is, it was the slogan, Silmiya, Silmiya. And seeing that on television, because I was in America at the time, it revived my soul that after all of the struggle of people like Mubarak Awad, like myself, like Peter, like Jacques Duval, like this center, did not go to waste. It did produce results. It was slow. It was tough, but nevertheless, it has borne fruits. And it's true. Not every positive change in history is the result of a peaceful struggle, but at least as many of those positive changes are the product of peaceful struggle. And the literature outside, as well as our own writings, reflect that at least in our part of the world. In the Arab world, in the Middle East, the population makes about 6% of world population. And yet that region has witnessed more than 40% of world armed conflicts since 1945. So we had at least 6 times our share of armed conflict in a region that is underdeveloped, in a region that needs every soul, every human being. And you mentioned Sudan, and the director of the US Institute of Peace mentioned Sudan. That is a country, just one example of those armed conflicts. Sudan. I'm taking Sudan, but I could as well be talking about Iraq, or about Palestine, or about any score of countries in the Middle East. Sudan, out of its 60 years of independence, 50 years were ridden by armed conflict. Sudan lost more than 2 million people killed in its civil war, protracted civil war, probably 10 times as many uprooted either inside Sudan itself or to neighboring countries. And that story is repeated in Iraq, Kurdistan, the rest of the Gulf, Palestine, Eritrea, Somalia. These are all part of our region. And yet, the only positive results out of these protracted conflicts came as a result of peaceful, negotiated settlements. And therefore, my message to you, to my fellow Middle Easterners, my fellow Arabs, my fellow revolutionaries in Tahrir Square, because the pictures in the Washington Post and New York Times today is really disturbing. I see scores of people wounded, 7 people killed last night in clashes over the controversial constitutional draft that the Muslim Brothers who ascended to power have tried to force on the rest of the population. Yes, they have a majority that brought Morsi to power, but it is by no means the consensus of the Egyptians to have a sectarian-like constitution that will exclude sizable sections of the population, that will frighten women about their rights and their future, that will threaten the citizenship rights of non-Muslims in my country, in Egypt, like the Christian Copts, like the Baha'is, like the Shia population. And therefore, people like myself find themselves back to square one. We fought, I was at odds with President Nasser, with President Sadat, with President Mubarak. Now I find myself at odds with Mr. Morsi, who was a prison mate with me in the last imprisonment. We teamed together for a year and a half. And yet that former prisoner who just got out and reached power is doing exactly what Mubarak used to do. And this is an irony that we have to reflect on, to ponder, but also to fight. So we are back at square one. We have to resume our fight, but we are still determined to make it as peaceful as we can. And with these remarks, I will conclude this first round of my participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Adam and Wanda?
Dziękuję bardzo za zaproszenie.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Czy słychać?
Can you hear me? Thank you very much for the invitation.
To jest dla kogoś takiego jak ja doskonała okazja, żeby pogratulować Instytutowi
For somebody like myself, this is a perfect occasion to congratulate the Institute
Już 10. rocznicy studiów nad walką bez przemocy.
of the 10th anniversary of studies of nonviolent conflict.
Ja jestem entuzjastą walki bez przemocy i zawsze nim byłem.
I am an enthusiast of nonviolent struggle. I've always been an enthusiast of nonviolent struggle.
Jestem entuzjastą walki bez przemocy dla 3 różnych motywów.
I'm an enthusiast of nonviolent struggle for 3 different reasons.
Po pierwsze dlatego, że cel nie uświęca środków.
Firstly, because the ends do not sanctify the means.
Przeciwnie, pewne środki stosowane w drodze do celu potrafią ten cel zdegenerować.
On the contrary, certain means used on the road to the end can degenerate the end.
Walka przy użyciu przemocy często prowadzi do przemocy jako istoty państwa po dyktaturze.
The use of violence in the struggle for freedom very often leads to a state which uses violence as a way of ruling.
Po drugie, walka bez przemocy pozwala z nas samych wyzwalać to, co lepsze jest w nas, a nie to, co gorsze.
Secondly, nonviolent struggle releases the best in us, not the worst in us.
I po trzecie, walka bez przemocy bywa bardziej skuteczna niż przemoc.
And finally, and thirdly, nonviolent struggle tends to be more effective than violent
I
means.
Europa centralna i wschodnia jest bardzo dobrym przykładem stosowania tych 3 zasad.
Central and Eastern Europe is a very good example of application of these 3 rules.
W okresie terroru stalinowskiego nie była możliwa żadna walka, ani bez przemocy, ani z przemocą, bo miejsce dla opozycji było na cmentarzu.
During Stalinism, of course, there was no room for any struggle, violent struggle or non-violent struggle, because the only room for the opposition was in the cemetery.
Coś zaczęło się zmieniać w okolicach 1956 roku. Władza komunistyczna zobaczyła, że stalinowska przemoc uderza także w nią samą.
Things started to alter somewhat around 1956 when the communist rulers took notice of the fact that the violence turns against them.
W nią samą, tak. I teraz od tego momentu, kiedy opozycja jest dostatecznie słaba, a władza już nie jest dostatecznie mocna, pojawia się pole dla walki bez przemocy.
So from this moment, when the opposition is sufficiently
Jest jeszcze dostatecznie słaba,
is still sufficiently weak,
a władza już nie jest dostatecznie mocna.
but the government is not sufficiently strong, the room for
Pojawia się pole,
opposition,
tak.
the room for opposition appears.
I ta walka przyjmuje rozmaite formy.
And the struggle takes different forms.
To są najpierw spotkania ludzi, którzy myślą krytycznie i postanawiają, że zaczną wspólnie myśleć krytycznie.
So first there are meetings of people who have critical thoughts about the government and decide to share these thoughts in common shared meetings.
Potem to jest próba rozpychania instytucji oficjalnych, poszerzania marginesu wolności.
Then there is an attempt to sort of broaden the scope of official institutions and to broaden the margin of freedom.
I to prowadzi do konfliktu w obrębie obozu rządzącego.
And this usually leads to the conflict within the governing camp.
Jedni mówią, nic nie zmieniać, bo jak się wyjmie jedną cegłę z budowli, to cała budowla runie.
So some of them say don't change anything. If you remove one brick from the construction of the government, the whole building will collapse.
A drudzy mówią, trzeba zmieniać, bo inaczej ta budowla zgnieje i się rozpadnie.
And the other ones say, no, 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 you have to change because if you don't make certain changes, the building will rot and fall apart.
I historia państw komunistycznych to jest w pewnym wymiarze historia tego konfliktu w obronie aparatu władzy.
So the history of communist
Krajów komunistycznych.
countries is the history of this sort of thought struggle of these two camps of, or these two lines of thought.
Excellent.
Nie przerywać.
Thank you, Wanda.
I teraz druga warstwa tej historii to jest to, co się dzieje w społeczeństwie.
Now, the second layer of the story is what is happening in the society.
W społeczeństwie zaczynają organizować się siły najpierw wokół rozszerzenia programu w kinach i w teatrach.
So in the society, the forces are getting organized first to promote broadening the range of movies and plays, shows shown in theaters.
Na początku możliwe były tylko filmy sowieckie bądź komunistyczne, a teraz się pojawia Buñuel, Antonioni, Bergman.
So at first only Soviet or communist movies are permitted, and then suddenly, slowly we see Buñuel, we see Bergman, we see Antonioni.
W teatrze pojawia się Arthur Miller, Brecht.
Plays by Brecht and Arthur Miller show in theaters.
I inni oczywiście. Zaczyna się walka o to, jakie książki wolno opublikować.
Then the struggle starts over what books can be published.
No więc pojawia się Franz Kafka, Hemingway, Steinbeck, Faulkner, Camus i tak dalej.
So you heard that. I'm not translating. It's too boring.
Pojawia się walka o autonomię uniwersytetu.
Then this, you see the force, the struggle for the autonomy of universities.
I wszystko to razem dostaje ze strony propagandy komunistycznej nazwę rewizjonizm.
And all of this is called by communist propaganda revisionism.
Rewizjoniści to są ci, którzy rewidują podstawy stalinizmu.
So revisionists are those who are revising the fundamentals of Stalinism.
I taki jest sens wydarzeń w 1956 roku
And this is the sense of events of 1956
w Polsce i na
in
Węgrzech,
Poland and in Hungary,
w Czechosłowacji
In the
w
Czech
1968.
Czechoslovakia in 1968.
To są te trzy wielkie próby reformy komunizmu w stronę liberalną czy demokratyczną.
So these were the first three great attempts to reform communism in the direction of more liberal, more democratic state.
Są dwa czynniki, które powodują, że ta reforma wydaje się konieczna.
There are two factors which seem to say that this reform is necessary.
Po pierwsze, to jest permanentny kryzys gospodarczy.
First, the permanent economic crisis.
Wielki węgierski ekonomista Kornai János to nazywa gospodarka niedoboru.
The great Hungarian economist János Kornai calls the economy of shortages.
Drugi czynnik to są społeczne niepokoje.
The second factor is social unrest.
Te społeczne niepokoje wymuszają refleksję, jak sobie z nimi radzić.
The social unrest forces a reflection on how to handle them.
I dochodzi do spotkania reformatorskiej części obozu władzy z reformatorską częścią aktywnego społeczeństwa.
And that leads to a meeting of the reformist side or fraction in the ruling camp with the reformist part of society.
W konsekwencji dochodzi do konfrontacji tych dwóch światów.
The two worlds confront one another.
Po jednej stronie są konserwatyści, nie chcą zmian, po drugiej stronie są ci z reformatorskiego skrzydła władzy i ze społeczeństwa, którzy zmian pragną.
So on one hand you have the conservatives who don't want to change anything, and on the other hand you have the representatives of the power camp who want reform and the social forces, societal forces which are looking for reform and change.
Do pierwszej takiej drastycznej konfrontacji dochodzi w 1956 roku na Węgrzech.
The first such drastic confrontation happened in Hungary in 1956.
Siły konserwatywne mają wielkiego protektora w postaci Moskwy i Kremla.
Of course, the conservative forces have a great protector in the form of Soviet Union and Kreml.
Nie mając żadnych szans w konfrontacji bez przemocy, sięgają po przemoc i na Węgry wkracza sowiecka armia.
Not having any chance for a non-violent confrontation, they go for violent confrontation. The Soviet army enters Budapest, enters Hungary.
I to jest pierwsza lekcja dla ruchów bez przemocy.
And this is the first lesson for non-violent struggle movement.
Nasza akcja non-violence ma swoje granice.
There are limits to our non-violent struggle.
Nie wygramy przy pomocy kijów i kałasznikowów wojny ze Związkiem Sowieckim.
You can't win a war with the Soviet Union using sticks and Kalashnikovs.
Więc wszystkie nasze działania muszą brać pod uwagę, po pierwsze,
Then all our activities have to take into account first
interesy Kremla,
Kremlin's interests,
po drugie interesy rządzącej nomenklatury komunistycznej.
and secondly the interests of the governing communist nomenclatura.
Czeska wiosna w 1968 roku, praska wiosna, pokazała, że nie wystarczy akcja bez przemocy.
Prague Spring of 1968 also showed that non-violent struggle is not sufficient.
Że jeżeli nawet tą drogą można osiągnąć, czy próbować osiągać władzę w państwie, to nawet jeżeli w ogóle przemocy nie ma, wkracza sowiecka armia.
It showed that even if you can take over power within the country with a non-violent struggle, you have to contend with the entry of the Soviet army.
Teraz w międzyczasie dochodzi oczywiście do konfliktów, gdzie istnieje przemoc.
Now, of course, in the meantime, conflicts arise where violence exists.
W Poznaniu w 1956 roku robotnicy wychodzą na ulicę, rozbijają więzienie, do nich strzelają i oni strzelają.
In Poznan in 56, the workers go into the streets, they break into prisons, they shoot, and they're getting shot at.
W 1956 roku w listopadzie węgierskie społeczeństwo broni się przed sowiecką interwencją i też są ofiary, a później ofiary plutonów egzekucyjnych.
In November of 56, the Hungarian society is defending itself from Soviet invasion. There are victims, and then there are victims of the shooting squads.
W Polsce dochodzi do bardzo gwałtownych starć w grudniu 70 roku.
In Poland, we had very violent events in December of 1970.
Wspólną cechą tych wszystkich wybuchów przemocy jest ich spontaniczność.
A shared feature of all these explosions of violence is that they were spontaneous.
Ich nikt nie planuje i nimi nikt nie kieruje.
Nobody planned them and nobody is managing them.
W związku z tym one po sobie nic nie pozostawiają.
In effect, they leave nothing behind them.
70 rok w Polsce pozostawił ogromny kompleks w środowiskach intelektualnych.
The year 1970 left behind a tremendous inferiority complex in the intellectual circles.
W 1968 roku w Polsce doszło do masowych demonstracji studenckich, które były protestem przeciwko konfiskacji spektaklu teatralnego Mickiewicza i szerzej przeciwko cenzurze.
In 1968 in Poland, there were mass demonstrations of students protesting against closing of a play in a theater by Mickiewicz and against censorship.
Ten ruch został rozbity.
This movement was shattered.
Wielu ludzi powędrowało do więzień.
Many people went to jail.
Ale po jakimś czasie oni wyszli z więzień i dalej poczuli się wspólnotą, która chce coś robić razem.
But after a while they were released from prison and they felt they were a community that wanted to do something together.
Ale wtedy w 1968 roku studenci byli sami. Studenci i ich profesorowie, literaci byli sami.
But in 1968, the students, the professors, writers, they were alone.
I w tym momencie jakby te pałki policyjne złamały kręgosłup tej opozycyjnej inteligencji.
So at that time, the police batons broke the backbone of the opposition intelligentsia.
I w grudniu 70 roku ta inteligencja milczała, kiedy strzelano do robotników.
And in December of 1970, the intelligentsia was quiet, was silent when the workers were being shot at.
Ale ten ruch robotniczy, masowe demonstracje, podpalanie komitetów partyjnych doprowadził do zmiany kierownictwa partii komunistycznej.
But this violent workers' explosion, the setting on fire of Communist Party committees, powtórzysz ostatnie zdanie, że
Do zmiany kierownictwa partii.
they led to the change in the leadership of the Communist Party.
Więc to nie był ruch bez przemocy,
So this was not a non-violent struggle,
chociaż zaczynał się od strajku bez przemocy.
Even though it started with a non-violent strike.
Ale kiedy aresztowano liderów strajku,
But when the leaders of the strike were arrested,
robotnicy wyszli na ulicę,
the workers went into the streets.
zaczęto podpalać komitety
They started
partyjne.
setting these Communist Party committee buildings on fire.
I w tym momencie władza cofnęła się.
And at this point, the rulers stepped back.
To jest bardzo ważny moment.
This is a very important moment.
Dlatego, że cała późniejsza walka bez przemocy, która okazała się skuteczna,
Because all the later non-violent struggle, which turned out to be effective,
miała w cieniu te poprzednie doświadczenia.
had in the shadows of it were these prior experiences.
Władza wiedziała, że nie może posunąć się za daleko,
The communist power knew that they can't go too far
dlatego że wiedziała, że ich partyjne komitety można podpalić.
because it knew that the party committee buildings do burn.
A to z kolei ich delegitymizowało w oczach Moskwy.
And in effect, that delegitimized them in the eyes of Moscow.
Więc władza musiała balansować i myśmy musieli balansować.
So they had to kind of balance, find an equilibrium, and we had to find a proper point of balance or equilibrium.
Słuchając doktora Sada, miałem miałem taką pokusę, żeby spojrzeć na to po polskim okiem.
Listening to Dr. Sad, I had this temptation to look at it through the Polish eyes.
Więc trzy elementy wydały mi się wyjątkowo ważne.
Three elements I find particularly important.
Po pierwsze, istnienie niezależnych środowisk opozycyjnej inteligencji.
First of all, the existence of circles of independent intelligentsia.
Po drugie, istnienie establishmentu, Mubaraka, przedtem Nassera i innych, który wydawał się nienaruszalny,
Secondly,
monolityczny.
the existence of an establishment, first of Sadat, then of Mubarak, which seemed to be immutable.
I po trzecie, rola wojska.
And thirdly, the role of the military.
Do tego wszystkiego trzeba dodać rolę religii, która się staje ideologią polityczną.
To all this, you have to add the role being played by religion, which becomes an ideological force.
Jest. Otóż,
Hence,
z polskiej perspektywy patrząc,
looking at it from the Polish perspective,
myśmy tak samo byli przekonani, że system jest monolityczny i każdy wstrząs składany z zewnątrz w tym systemie był zaskoczeniem.
first of all, we also thought that the system of power was monolithic, and any kind of shaking or trembling of the system that came from the outside surprised us.
On był zaskoczeniem nie tylko dla obserwatorów z zewnątrz, ale dla nas, dla obywateli.
Thus, not only was it a surprise for external observers, but also for us, the citizens.
W tym momencie ogromną rolę odgrywało radio wolna Europa.
Radio Free Europe played a tremendous role at that point.
Bo dzięki temu radiu to, co się wydarzyło w jednej fabryce, w jednym mieście, natychmiast stało się znane wszystkim, którzy słuchali tego radia, to były miliony ludzi.
Thanks to Radio Free Europe, events that took place in one factory in one Polish town were immediately known to millions of Poles who listened to Radio Free Europe.
Środowiska emigracyjne były niesłychanie ważnym oparciem dla grup intelektualnych.
The diaspora, the immigrant circles were a tremendous support for the opposition in Poland.
Dlatego, że możliwy był dzięki nim dialog na temat strategii i taktyki, dialog bez cenzury.
Thanks to them, there was a venue for a dialogue about strategy and tactics without censorship.
Jeśli chodzi o wojsko, to myśmy wiedzieli jedno. Wojsko będzie użyte wtedy, kiedy władza poczuje, że jest fizycznie zagrożona. Fizycznie.
As to the military, we knew that the military will be used when the communists will feel that physically threatened.
Dlatego powtarzaliśmy, że my nie chcemy nikogo wieszać, że nie chcemy odwetu.
That's why we kept repeating that we don't want to hang anybody, we don't want retribution.
Mówiliśmy, siądźmy do stołu, porozmawiajmy, szukajmy kompromisu.
We said, let's sit down at a table, let's talk, let's find a compromise.
Jeśli mówię o walce bez przemocy, to jest rzeczą niezwykle ważną, żeby wiedzieć, że
When I'm talking about nonviolent struggle, it's also very important to know
walka bez przemocy to były prywatne seminaria,
that nonviolent struggle constituted such things as private seminars,
nieoficjalne wykłady,
unofficial lectures,
nieoficjalne związki studenckie,
unofficial student unions,
nieoficjalne związki zawodowe,
unofficial labor unions,
nieoficjalne wydawnictwa,
unofficial publications,
nieoficjalne pisma.
and unofficial newspapers.
Wszystko to razem składało się na polskie, niezależne społeczeństwo obywatelskie.
Of this together constituted Polish independent civil society.
Oczywiście to było mniejszościowe,
It was a minority, of course,
ale władza miała problem,
but the powers that be had a problem.
a ten problem się brał z polityki Zachodu.
And that problem came from the Western policies.
To były dwa elementy były bardzo ważne.
And two elements here were very important.
Konferencja w Helsinkach
The Helsinki Conference
i trzeci koszyk.
and
Trzeci koszyk, ten o prawach
the third
człowieka.
basket having to do with human rights.
I wybór prezydenta Cartera, który ogłosił, że human rights to jest doktryna polityki amerykańskiej.
And of course the election of President Carter, who announced that human rights is part of the American doctrine.
To podstawę już tu kończę, bo widzę, że
I'm finishing because I see that Peter is nervous.
Żebym powiedział o tym non-violence nie to, co powinienem.
That he's nervous that I said not what I should have said about non-violent struggle.
No, not at all. Thank you. I'm going to skip the questions I have, but Assad, if there's anything you want to comment on that you heard from Adam, that if you could take a few minutes and then we'll get back on schedule and enter to the crowd and ask them to ask.
Yes, I just want to highlight the point that the solidarity struggle in Poland was inspirational for Democrats in my region, and I suspect Democrats around the world. So it just shows that somehow chains of history are interlinked. And whatever happened in Poland, in Eastern Europe, was of great impact on us. And the impact was multi-level. One of them was, and you raise a question about the role of the intellectuals, the role of religion, the role of the army. And very briefly, intellectuals in Egypt and the Arab world, seeing these democratic revolutions in Eastern Europe quickly spreading from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia, then to back to Eastern Europe, and then to sub-Saharan Africa, but escaping the Middle East, gave rise to Huntington-like theories about Arab exceptionalism, that somehow Muslims and Arabs are not suited for democracy. And that, to us, was like a spear in our heart. How could we? Are we really immune to democracy? Are Arabs and Muslims don't believe, don't feel the impulse for freedom? That took us 20 years of intellectual fighting to prove that we are human beings like everybody else, that we long for democracy, we long for freedom like everybody else. The revolution against Suharto in Indonesia gave us the first good argument that at least Islam and religion has nothing to do with whether you are a Democrat or not. We were reminded that the Catholic Church at one time considered democracy as evil. It took them 100 years to reverse their position. And it was that reversal that helped the revolution in Poland and in Eastern Europe. So we knew even the most ardent of social institutions, like religion, like the church, are not immune to change. That was important. And then we have Indonesia, the largest Muslim majority country in the world, revolting, and peacefully, by the way, peacefully, non-violently, against a long-standing dictator, Suharto, who ruled for nearly 30 years. So these examples around the world really move the intellectuals to be more determined to say, no, we are not an exception. There's nothing called Islamic or Muslim exceptionalism. Nothing is Arab exceptionalism. Human beings are human beings everywhere, and we're entitled to the same rights, to the Universal Declaration, to freedom. And that was important for us. Eastern Europe, Poland, solidarity, and all the freedom movement around the world, somehow very invisible, like silk chain to freedom fighters everywhere, inspiring each other. And when I saw Adam 2 days ago, I felt as if he's a brother that I have known for a long time, even though I was seeing him the first time. But there was a kindred spirit that makes freedom fighters somehow have a bond. I felt the same way in prison with other freedom fighters, even ones that I completely disagree with, like the jihadists, like the Islamists. And, once in prison, everybody is a fellow prisoner, and there is a bond somehow. And you exchange experience, you help each other against a common tyrant that has brought all of us, Shias, Baha'is, jihadists, communists, liberals, to the same prison. It was an amazing experience in a way. Not that I wish it on anybody, but it was for me. In retrospect, it was all worth it. Just one lesson my dialogue with jihadists as a Democrat, as a liberal, and these are Islamists. These are the ones who assassinated President Sadat, who carried violent struggle for years and years, not only in Egypt, but all over the world, from Philippines to Bosnia to Chechnya. Of course, Afghanistan was a big thing. And some of them was me in prison. And we have this dialogue, a dialogue that I say, in retrospect, had transformed them to a non-violent jihadist, to a democratic jihadist. And this may sound like a contradiction in terms, but it has happened. And I was witness to it. I was part of it. It made me feel that maybe there was a hidden wisdom in the fact that I went to prison. The unintended consequences of human savagery, of human tyranny, yet it can produce some very interesting and positive results. So I'm inspired. I say, yes, the role of religion is important, but religion, again, could be used either way. Either the force of emancipation, like, it happened in Latin America, the liberation theology, like I saw it happening with me in prison, with some of the jihadists, Islamic jihadists, transforming and becoming now ardent Democrats. And they're fighting, along with people like myself, nowadays, these jihadists, against the Muslim Brothers' tendency to slip into tyranny again. And it really is a very important lesson that a fellow victim, being a victim at one time, is not immunity, that freedom won once is not immune to being taken away, to being aborted. So that is, I think, the lesson from Poland, from Eastern Europe. It took Poland 10 years to get rid of the communist regime. But it took the next Eastern European country only 1 year. And then the third, 10 months. And then the fourth, 10 days. And then the fifth, 10 hours. And that, to me, as a social scientist, not as a fighter, it was inspirational in many ways. It taught us that, yes, there is a multiplier effect. There is a learning, not only for, and this nonviolent struggle that we are celebrating here now should be our mantle, because no matter what, even if it takes longer, I think it is worth, it deserves to be given a full chance to spare blood and to spare human lives everywhere. So I'm inspired by Adam's remarks. I thank you. I think all of the things you mentioned, intellectuals, religion, civil society, are important pieces in rebuilding a new order, a new democratic order in our part of the world and elsewhere. Thank you.
So we'll be on schedule if we skip my questions and go to yours. So please. Do we have a microphone for the people who want to?
Thank you very much for this inspiring and also sobering talk about the revolution and resistance. I think in Egypt it was very inspiring and somehow also spoiling that in just 18 days we were able to topple a dictator who remained in power for 30 days. But I think one of the factors that maintained the peacefulness and the nonviolence during those 18 days is that quickly the Egyptian army allegedly sided with the people. At least we were under that impression in the first place. But what do you say to the peaceful protesters that were in front of the Ittihadiyya Palace in Egypt just a few days ago, and they were met by extreme violence of other rallying protesters who were, or not protesters, actually supporters of Morsi, attacking people, beating them up, harassing women? They have one of three choices: is either to fight back and be equally violent, retreat, or sit there and die in being beaten up. So what is your advice? What do you say to these people? Thank you.
She started, I think.
Well, thank you. This is Nancy O'Kale, one of the victims of, again, tyrannical rules. She is a Freedom House former program officer in Egypt. And yet she was, among the victims of military Islamic combination rule in the last year and a half. And Nancy, I think you are raising a very, important and agonizing question. What do we do in a time of revolution when cards get so mixed up, when you don't know who's fighting for what? The closest approximation to the scene in Egypt today, I'm afraid to say, and I'm sorry to say, is Germany in the 30s, when the Nazis were democratically elected to power. And yes, they did not have a majority, and Morsi never had a majority. Morsi is, and the Muslim Brothers are ruling Egypt with only 25% of the votes of the eligible electorate. So in a way, I think Hitler was 31%. Morsi and the Muslim Brothers is 25%. Yet it is a plurality. It was a biggest bloc, and therefore they ascended to power because the others got smaller percentage. And why am I bringing this analogy? Because even though Hitler was in power, yet his Nazi followers chased and persecuted all other organized forces in Germany. So having come to power through democratic means is no guarantee that he will remain a Democrat or that he will respect pluralism or the rules of the game, the next election. And I'm afraid to say that the one man, one vote, one time, maybe lurking there. And that's why I call on our friends all over the world, Democrats in America, in Europe, elsewhere in the world, the community of democracies, to be very alert to what's happening in Egypt. Egypt is the pivotal country in the region, and whatever happens in Egypt will set the stage for the entire Middle East. And as I said, that region is very important. Peace, democracy, and development are three sides of what we are struggling for. And therefore, we should not allow democracy in Egypt to fail. We should not allow a new Islamic tyranny, even if it is wrapped into a democratic election, to stay. And here comes what I call creative conditionality by the community of democracies led by the US. And that is to refuse to deal with a government, Islamic or otherwise, in our region, unless it respects the rules of the game, the due process, and that creative conditionality is very important. What do the US or the community of democracies have to bargain with? Aid, trade, and recognition. These are three very important instruments, peaceful, all of them peaceful. We're not asking for armed intervention or anything. Use this leverage, the conditionality, to make sure that you are using your own democratic institutions to help us develop our own democratic institution. use your freedom to help us maintain our freedom. And I think that is all, again, nonviolent. It's all peaceful. But I think in the medium and the long run, it is effective and lasting and humane and compassionate. And that would be my answer. Support those protesters, advise, and use creative conditionality. Nancy got driven out of the country. And I told the field marshal in writing that Nancy is more or no less patriotic than you were. And the army was up in arms, the armed forces. How could I liken a woman, a young girl, to the field marshal, the commander of the Egyptian army? And they sent, all kind of generals to debate me on television. How could you? Especially when I mentioned her merits, I said she's an accomplished ballerina. And the word ballerina in Arabic, راقصة ballet. So how could I equate a راقصة ballet with the field marshal? This is the toughest institution and the commander of that institution. How could he be even compared to a woman, to a girl, to a ballerina, رقاصة? And I told the general, the first debate on television, do you know what a ballerina, the training of a ballerina involved? How many years were you trained to be until you became a general? And said, what does this have to do with this? I said, well, it has to do with everything. Because I mentioned all of her other qualifications, her PhD from Oxford, and all the work she has done as civil society, as a former officer at Ibn Khaldun, my center. So he said, and where did she learn to be a ballerina? I said, in Moscow. I said, what was she doing in Moscow? When I said that her father was a military attaché, and he tried to figure out the name, and he said, was he General such and such? I said, yes. The guy got up and saluted. It was almost conditional, almost a reflex. And of course, it was a laughing. It's an interesting debate on many levels, but we have, again, to remain vigilant and nonviolent and to stick to our guns, persist, and no matter how it takes, we will prevail at the end. We must stay fast.
Adam, you want to know?
Ja chciałem dorzucić obserwację Europejczyka na temat tego, co mówił dr Said o aktualnej sytuacji w Egipcie.
I wanted to add a handful of European observations to what Dr. Said was just talking about the situation in Egypt.
My też obserwujemy zjawiska niebezpiecznego regresu.
We also are witnessing phenomena of dangerous regression.
No tutaj trzeba oczywiście zacząć od Rosji.
First, obviously, we have to mention Russia in this context.
Putin oznacza regres w stosunku do demokracji rosyjskiej sprzed 20 lat.
Putin is an enormous, major step back compared to Russian democracy of 20 years ago.
To jest, to co on tworzy, to jest taka demokracja fasadowa.
He's creating a facade, Potemkin kind of democracy.
To jest pogarda dla państwa prawa.
He has a contempt for rule of law.
I tego może najlepszym przykładem jest los Michaiła Chodorkowskiego.
And the best example of this may be the fate of Mikhail Khodorkovsky.
Podobną drogą, chociaż oczywiście w zupełnie inny sposób, podążają Węgry.
A similar route, although executed in a somewhat different way, is taken by the Hungarians.
Reżim obecnego premiera Viktora Orbana to jest dążenie do przekreślenia zasad demokratycznego państwa prawa.
What the current Prime Minister Viktor Orban is doing, this is an attempt to basically cancel a legitimate democratic rule of law.
Mnie się wydaje, że amerykańska opinia publiczna powinna się uważnie przyglądać temu, co dzieje się w Budapeszcie.
I think that the American public opinion should look very carefully at what is happening in Budapest.
Dlatego, że to jest możliwy czarny scenariusz dla całej Europy Centralnej i Wschodniej.
Because this could be a potential black scenario for the entire Central and Eastern Europe.
Viktor Orban może nie siedział w więzieniu jako obecny prezydent Egiptu, ale był liberałem w opozycji.
Viktor Orban was not jailed, maybe like the current president of Egypt, but he was an active member of opposition.
A dzisiaj
Liberal opposition.
Sięga po język takiego autorytarnego populisty i nacjonalisty.
And today he uses the language of a populist and a
Chauvinist.
nationalist authoritarianism.
Chauvinist.
Chauvinist authoritarianism.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I am privileged perhaps to be intimately familiar with both sides of the world that have been presented today, as I am the son of an expert on Poland and somebody who spent his whole life writing about the Polish scene, and I grew up with that, and at the same time I'm an Arabist, so-called, and know the Arab world. So it's, for me, this is a particularly interesting discussion, and I've been friends with Saad for 30 years, if that's possible, Saad. And I'm very moved by your presentation tonight. And I have a very practical question for you. And that is, in terms of the new opposition that has emerged, let's call it the new opposition, which seems still quite fragmented in so many ways. One concern I have is that the opposition will be built around the ideological pole of secularism as opposed to Islamism. And if that's the kind of polarized debate that's going to emerge, I fear for the future of the opposition as it's emerged. Can the opposition that now exists reach out to Islamists as well? I'm thinking not only of obvious people like Abdul Fattah and others, but young Islamists like Ibrahim Hudaybi and others who are equally disillusioned with the Ikhwan. Can we think about an opposition movement that is not going to be pegged as one that's simply opposed to an Islamic vision, but one that can embrace it democratically as well? Thank you.
My dear friend, thank you for raising this very important question. And you are as familiar with the Egyptian scene as anybody on this side of the Atlantic. And you have known many of the figures that now are important on the Egyptian scene. And my answer to your question is that we have to. Everybody has to reach out to everybody else. I don't know if you, with the last time you visited our center, the Ibn Khaldun Center, but within 150 meters of the center, the Muslim brothers came to the same area and established their headquarters. During their days of, shall we say, defamation by the former regime, we had given them a platform in Ibn Khaldun 12 times. They spoke at Ibn Khaldun conferences. And they have, because they could not do rallies anywhere else, they came to my center to do their work. And in a recent debate with one of their leaders, I said, how come? 12 times you guys came to Ibn Khaldun. Once you reached power, you did not invite us even once in reciprocity. Where is your human generosity? Where is your gratitude for people who stood by you during your time of need? And the guy was very embarrassed because I said, you are one of the people who came to Ibn Khaldun. He said, it's true. I said, how come? You or your colleagues in the Muslim Brotherhood, even though you are within 3 minutes from where we are, you never invited us. He said, oh, I'm sorry for that. We are going to fix that. I said, you will? He said, yes. That's, again, in a televised debate. And then I had a recent debate about a week ago with one of their leaders. And I repeated the same thing. He said, oh, we're sorry about that. We'll fix it. I said, I heard fixing it 8 weeks ago, and you have not fixed it yet. However, at least I want our audience, television, probably 20 million viewers, to hear you saying that at least twice. So the third time I debate a Muslim brother, I have to remind you that there are 20 million viewers watching us, and you promised to fix something and you did not fix it. And that is to dialogue with other people like the Ibn Khaldun, the liberal epicenter of the Egyptian movement. So in answer to your question, yes, we have to speak to them. So even though they are in power now and a little bit of arrogance, yet the recent demonstration this last week showed them three things, very important. One is that they are not the only force in Egypt able to send million people to Tahrir Square. Because for a long time, they have always gloated that they're the only political movement who is capable of mass mobilization. Last week, young, unexperienced, but yet determined idealists were able to put 100 million people without the Muslim Brothers in Tahrir Square. So what do the Muslim Brothers do? Say, all right, we are going to make a bigger rally. And they identified one place they were going to do it. So residents of the neighborhood where they were going to do it threatened them publicly. Said, if you ever show up here, we will eliminate you by force. So find somewhere else. This was Abdin Square, which is not very far from Tahrir Square. So they went to Cairo University when there is no neighborhoods. There's a lot of empty space in front of the campus, all the way between the campus and the night, and that's where they held their rally. However, that rally tempted them to threaten the Constitutional Court, to surround, 2 days later, to surround the Constitutional Court, to intimidate the judges of that court, and that is what triggered this last series of events. So we have now a very intense fight between the judiciary, the presidency, all other political forces, and the Muslim Brothers. We hope that that fight will remain, to a great extent, peaceful. Of course, according to the papers today, front page in the New York Times and the Washington Post, you see pictures almost like a war zone picture of a lot of victims. But we know, if you read the fine print, only about 8 people were killed. Of course, every soul could not be valued, but 8 people were killed in this last round of confrontation. We hope that they will take the lesson. not only of the ability of other forces to mobilize, but also of the other forces to be as determined to fight their tyranny as they fought Mubarak's tyranny and other tyrannies around the region. So I think there's a lot of lessons to learn. I think the dialogue channels are open and they should remain open. And I'm going back to Egypt in 2 days, and I'm determined, along with others, to keep that. I did not talk here about new movements that are emerging. One of them is called the national movement, Al-Haraka Al-Wataniya, with a lot of secularists who do not apologize for being secularists, for being, they use the word civic instead of secular in Arabic. But that kind of courage of not having to hide their convictions that they are not Islamist and they do not intend to be Islamist, but they are willing to be equal partners, equal discussant, equal fellows in rebuilding or building democratic Egypt. So what is really emerging is true pluralism. It is not equal yet, but it is its way to equality. And I think we have a better chance now of fighting, and I'm challenging Morsi, who was a fellow prison mate, to, if he really thinks that he has a majority, and since we're having a new constitution, is to reopen the field for a new election for the presidency. Not just only a referendum on the constitution, but also an election for the presidency. And I don't know if you will take the challenge or not, but that is something that we should, as democratic forces, insist on. If he wants a new mandate, he should reopen the field for a new election.
Adam, you wanted to make a few brief comments, and then I want to take one more
Na
question.
kilka zdań, komentarzy na temat religii.
I wanted to say a few sentences of commentary about the role of religion.
Polska jest najbardziej chyba katolickim krajem w Europie dzisiaj.
Today, Poland is probably the most Catholic country in Europe.
I Kościół katolicki to była wielka siła wolnościowa w latach dyktatury.
And during the years of dictatorship, the Catholic Church was the great force for freedom.
Tą siłę legitymizował Jan Paweł II, który był Polakiem.
John Paul II, who, as you know, was Polish, legitimized that force, that power.
Język Kościoła w tych latach to był język praw człowieka.
The language of the church during the years of dictatorship was the language of human rights.
Prawa człowieka to była droga do praw Kościoła.
Human rights was a route to the rights of the church.
Otóż to się po śmierci papieża zmieniło.
This changed, altered after the death of John Paul II.
I dziś wielki sektor polskiego kościoła katolickiego zachowuje się tak jak bracia muzułmańscy w Egipcie.
And today a greatest part of the Polish Catholic Church acts like the Muslim brothers in Egypt.
I mnie się wydaje, że to jest zawsze niebezpieczny rezultat polityzacji religii.
And to me, this is the always dangerous result of politicization of religion.
I to samo dzieje się wszędzie. W Iranie, w Izraelu.
The same thing is happening everywhere in Iran, in Israel,
Czy w Rosji.
and in Russia.
Tyle.
Thank you. Moza,
I just want to inform you that breaking news from AP states that when the night fell in Cairo, tens of thousands of people conquered the
Mikro.
and they,
Ma microphone.
yeah, they broke.
Ma microphone.
Yeah, they broke the fence and passed over the tanks, and they shouting, "Morsi should go." So maybe Dr. Saadettin Ibrahim should go back earlier than 2 days.
Rozumiałeś?
That, before I take the next question, let me tell you who just spoke there. Mohsen Sazagara was on the plane with Ayatollah Khomeini the day he flew from France to Iran to take power. Unfortunately for Mohsen, but I think good for what we're doing, he entered a fundamental period of disagreement with what the Ayatollah was doing, and he was jailed many times, held several hunger strikes, put himself at the risk of his life, and now is in exile, thinking through the very same issues that you are, Saad, and that Adam, I think, can help with. And that's why the center is here, to create that kind of dialogue between people from different movements, to see what kind of sustenance they can get from others who had similar experiences. So who raised their hand here? I'll get you next. No. We just have about another 10 minutes, so we can make them short, and then, yeah.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask about the temptation of going into the government during the course of one of these struggles. I know in Poland you were in the parliament briefly, and what your perception was as a member of parliament and why you decided not to stay. Okay. It goes to the course of, like, the president in Egypt, of having been a prisoner and now coming out and behaving in a way very different than one might have expected, and what you saw when you were going through this process.
That was for you, Adam. I
You
think.
need
Yeah,
to
that's
finish
true.
listening to the
Oh, okay.
translation, guys.
Ja nie zrozumiałem. 2 sekundy.
Pokusa wejścia do rządu. Byłeś w parlamencie bardzo krótko. Czy miałeś kiedyś pokusę wejścia do
Maybe
rządu?
we'll
W
pass
kontekście tego, jak
Okej.
Morsi się teraz zachowuje.
Okej, to jest problem Morsiego, to jest problem zwycięskich rewolucjonistów.
The Morsi problem is the problem of victorious revolutionaries.
To jest problem Cromwella, Jakobinów,
This was the problem of Cromwell, of Jacobines,
Lenina,
Lenin's problem.
Mao Tse-tunga, Fidela Castro.
On and on.
To jest także mój problem.
It was also my problem.
Ja nigdy nie chciałem być politykiem.
I never wanted to be a politician.
Ja byłem bardzo zaangażowany w politykę, kiedy to była walka z dyktaturą.
I was very engaged in politics when it consisted of a fight with a dictatorship.
A potem ja byłem w parlamencie,
I was an MP,
ale to była ta pierwsza kadencja parlamentu, kiedy odchodziliśmy od komunizmu i budowaliśmy demokratyczne państwo.
but this was the first term of the parliament, the transitional term when we're leaving communism and building a democratic state.
Więc ja mówiłem sobie, że to jest jak na wojnie. No.
So I said to myself, this is like during the war.
Jak jest wojna, czyli przemoc,
When there is war, violence,
to znaczy każdy architekt, dentysta i hydraulik oraz dziennikarz
then every architect, plumber and dentist, also a journalist,
wkłada mundur i idzie na wojnę.
puts on a uniform and goes to war.
I to była moja wojna, to był ten pierwszy parlament.
So the first term of the parliament was my war.
A potem wygraliśmy wojnę, to ja wróciłem do cywila. No.
And then we won the war and I went back to civilian life.
Ale wielu moich kolegów niestety zostało w polityce i nie zdjęło munduru.
Alas, many of my friends stayed in politics and did not take off the uniforms.
I to była filozofia taka.
It's a what?
To taka była filozofia.
And the philosophy was as follows.
Dotąd rządzili komuniści, to teraz my.
Until now the communists were the rulers, and now it's our turn.
My Solidarność, my katolicy.
We, Solidarity, we, the Catholics.
I to było bardzo niebezpieczne.
It was very dangerous.
Ja to nazywałem antykomunizm z bolszewicką twarzą.
I called it anti-communism with a Bolshevik face.
No, mnie się wydaje, że to, co nam jest potrzebne po dyktaturze,
I think that what we need after a dictatorship,
to jest taki okres średnich temperatur.
we need a period of middling temperatures,
Bardzo często kompromisów,
very often compromises,
nieprzyjemnych kompromisów.
unpleasant compromises.
W Polsce była wielka debata, czy sądzić Jaruzelskiego, czy nie.
In Poland, we had a great debate whether Jaruzelski should be put on trial or not.
Jaruzelski to był generał, który wprowadził stan wojenny.
As you know, Jaruzelski was the general who introduced the martial law.
A później to był generał, który pomógł Polskę wyprowadzać ze stanu wojennego i prowadzić do demokracji.
And then he was a general who helped take Poland out of the martial law and into democracy.
Ja należałem do obrońców Jaruzelskiego,
I was one of the defenders of Jaruzelski,
chociaż przez wiele lat byłem jego więźniem.
although for many years I was his prisoner.
Ja rozmawiałem tak.
My reasoning was as follows.
My nie możemy po jednej wojnie domowej
We can't, after one civil war,
organizować dla Polski nowej wojny domowej.
organize another civil war for Poland.
I dlatego ja absolutnie się zgadzam z tym, co mówi dr Said.
And that's why I totally agree with what Dr. Said was saying.
Trzeba rozmawiać.
You need to talk.
Trzeba rozmawiać z ekstremistyczną prawicą,
You have to talk to the radical right,
z komunistami,
communists,
z religijnymi fundamentalistami.
with religious fundamentalists.
Dlatego, że po tym, co stało się w Polsce, nie mamy prawa do pesymizmu.
Because after what happened in Poland, we have no right to be pessimistic.
Musimy wierzyć w to, że człowiek się może zmienić na lepsze.
We have to believe that people can change for the better.
To jest ryzyko.
There is a risk involved.
Ale myśmy sobie mówili przez całe życie, że kto nie ryzykuje, w więzieniu nie siedzi.
All our lives we said to ourselves that those who don't take any risks don't go to jail.
Thank you so much. My question is going to Dr. Saad, and I heard you talking about the percentage of Morsi supporters in Egypt, where you said about 20%. For me, I think taking the experience of Sudan, the country I came from, the ruling party or the ruling regime there, they're only about 5%. They managed to change the constitution, every law in the country, and they make it lines with what they wanted. And I think they are the same ideology or the same group that they are there in Egypt. My question, what is going to happen? Because I have seen in the countries like Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, it is the same ideology. So what is going to happen, or what do you think?
I wish I could know what will happen. All what I know are lessons of history and the reality we're facing today. We know that revolutions have been hijacked before. The Russian Revolution, which was the work of patriotic national forces against the Tsars, started in February. By October, the hardcore communists, led by Lenin, came all the way from Paris and was able to hijack it. So that is first hijacking of a revolution in modern history. The second hijacking, my Persian Iranian brother, was the Iranian Revolution. The Mujahidi Khalq and other patriotic forces, including communists, in Tuda party and so on, were the ones who fought the Shah and the tyranny of the Shah. and they were driven out of the country, they were hanged, they were imprisoned. And yet, it accumulated to bring one of the greatest revolution in our region, the Iranian Revolution. The same thing. Came Khomeini and few of the very hardcore mullahs back to Iran from Paris, just like Lenin came from Paris on the train, if you have seen Dr. Zhivago. Same thing. We had something similar in Egypt. We had a Muslim brother leader, had been living in Qatar for many years. In the height of the revolution, he flew to Egypt, addressed the Muslim brother, addressed Tahrir Square, and the march of hijacking started with that speech in Tahrir. So these are lessons we have to learn. The hijacking of the Egyptian revolution, just like the hijacking of the Iranian revolution and the Russian revolution, and possibly the Tunisian and the Libyan, all of these are lessons to learn. And the way to fight them is to be vigilant and to call on like-minded Democrats, both in the country and in the world, in the community of democracies, to stand by our struggle. We are not going to exclude anybody from participating, but nor should we allow anybody to monopolize. And that should be our slogans. No monopoly of politics, no monopoly of power. Everybody should be an equal partner, and let the ballot box periodically produce a ruler. That is really the message that we should stand fast by. And that is, yes, we may get betrayed here and there, we may get setbacks here and there, but that's the only way to go if we want to remain nonviolent and true to our principles of democracy, civil society, and freedom. And I think probably that is the answer I would give. And that is my calling to you, living here in a democracy, is to keep an eye on us and to keep your government, because the message I got this morning from Cairo is that tell President Obama not to make any messages that the Muslim brothers are exploiting, that they have the backing of the US. And of course, you know, most Egyptians now believe that the Muslim brother could not have come to power without American help, without American support and blessing. I do not share that myself, but that is a conspiracy theory in our part of the world, that anything that happens, it must be the United States and the CIA behind it. So that is what people believe in the streets of Cairo. And therefore, when they learn that I'm going to speak today, said, please tell President Obama to stop supporting the Muslim brothers. I don't have his direct number to give him that message, but if you have ways of telling him that, please do. Thank you.
Thank you.
God and Adam, thank you very much. Thank all of you for joining us and participating in the celebration. As I said to you before, we are in the business of knowledge transmission. We have books, movies, online capabilities. Please use them. Use them in your coursework. Use them in your dialogue with others. Use them when you talk to people in Egypt or people in Iran, and then see if we can all profit from that knowledge. Thanks again for coming.